Okay.
We're good.
All righty. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have Kim Raath with us this morning, and I have done a silly thing and forgotten to pull up her bio, so bear with me just a moment. Uh, and it's been one of those beautiful rainy days, so we're all off to a great start. Reminds me of being back in Houston. Oh, I am in Houston. That was a joke. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us for our Creating and Growing a Purpose-Driven Business with Kim Raath. We're so excited to actually have her with us today. We have a few questions, and we really want to know a lot more about her and her company, Topl. Kim is the co-founder and CEO of Topl, which is an ESG technology company, and they have a purpose-built blockchain that empowers businesses to prove their ethical and sustainable practices. So founded in 2017, Topl empowers companies to drastically cut operational and certification costs. Their technology could track all instances of the business supply chain and the associated certification claims, opening up opportunities to create alternative sources of credit for producers while providing end-to-end consumers information on where and how their products are made. Kim has quite an interesting background. She grew up in South Africa. She is the first Rice University student to simultaneously complete a MA in economics and a PhD in statistics. Before university, Kim actually traveled a lot. She worked in 18 developing countries to rebuild and strengthen communities by implementing innovative forms of technology. As CEO, Kim innovates around every problem that arises and continuously finds ways to grow the entire Topl ecosystem. Kim, welcome. We're so happy to have you here this morning and so excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
I'm excited to be here.
Well, you are doing so many exciting things, and I think this morning is going to be great because not only will we learn about you and about really being purpose-driven, but I think we'll get a lot of education as well around things like blockchain. So excited to just jump in. Just want to let the audience know we're going to go through a few questions. If you could jot down questions that you might have for Kim, because at the end, about the last 10 minutes or so, we are going to open this up to questions. And I am sure you're going to have some. I know I still do, and I've already spoken to her. So, so Kim, I'm going to kind of jump in if that's okay, unless you want to say something yourself before we get started.
No, sure. Let's jump in.
Okay, sounds great. So really, I'd like to start with that educational aspect. Would you please describe blockchain and what does it do and what are the advantages?
So the biggest thing I always tell people is blockchains are everything you don't understand about the internet and that you don't understand about money in one thing. The biggest thing about blockchains is that they're just like AI and machine learning. It's a very difficult topic to understand and try and actually go into the hows. The biggest thing about blockchain technology is more the whys. Like why is there an advantage for using these technologies? What does it do? How does it differentiate from other technologies that we have accessible? And I think that's where I focus more on than understanding the how it works piece of it. I have a statistics PhD, and still to today, when people ask me what machine learning and AI is, I'd like, you need a very advanced base before you actually understand what those things are. And the same thing for blockchains. Blockchains kind of make up a consortium of different degree fields, computer science, economics, actually statistics too, a lot of cryptography, math that's involved as well. But if we talk about more the whys, why is blockchain technology differentiated? there are three things that I always talk about. I talk about long-term accountability that's been created through the technology, data democratization, and trustless transparency. So to break into each of those three different things, if you think about long-term accountability, a lot of the space that we refer to ourselves as the ESG blockchain. So a lot of the ESG space, what we're seeing so many times, we're seeing companies saying, purpose and profit don't go hand in hand, but for us, it actually does. And a lot of the questions you start, actually getting asked around tracking ESG and measuring ESG and, making decisions around ESG tracking and measuring is actually just more a thing of, I think ESG is more a shortcut to think about long-term profitability or long-term accountability. And what I mean by that is if you can ask the questions of how can I make my employees more happy, how can I avoid bad PR, how can I, build the brand affinity with my customer, how do I need to avoid safety recalls, like all these different questions that people end up asking, there can actually be rolled into like one specific question of how can I increase my positive impact? How can I create an environment where I can create long-term accountability within a organization, supply chain, so forth. So one thing that blockchains provide is that opportunity for you to actually record information in a tamper-proof manner in real time. So you can think about real-time audits. You can think about long-term accountability in the sense of you can start recording, farmers can record production histories, as you mentioned when you introduced me, is that farmers can start recording when they deliver goods to a specific supply chain. And as they deliver those goods, those actual histories, production histories that they're starting to develop becomes alternative forms of credit because now they have provable claims to the things that they're doing. A lot of what exists in this space, and this kind of goes into this, like the next piece of this, is institutional voids. Institutional voids exist in especially fragmented supply chains. So when you think about like actual long-term accountability, it becomes a situation of how can you connect the dots that have previously been damaged by the lack of trust between different parties. And so blockchain technology allows you to connect those dots. So that's kind of the long-term accountability piece of it. Then if you think about data democratization, it's kind of the same thing of me talking about this most disenfranchised individual on this side, say it be the farmer, and the biggest corporation on the other side of that supply chain or chain, essentially. What can you do to record censorship-proof network? How can we make sure that both these individuals can talk to the same censorship-proof network in a way that you actually have the most disenfranchised individual also recording information to that network so that when the brand actually receives the product and knows the products on the other side, they know that that farmer had to receive the living wage, or they know that what had happened labor practices wise on the ground was recorded from the source and wasn't recorded from the next point in the supply chain or the next point in the supply chain. Now, the one thing about what blockchains also offer is a secure way to immutably, in a tamper-proof manner, capture the information with history and then share the proof of that data, not necessarily revealing that data. So just proof that that had actually happened, that claim had actually happened, not necessarily, oh, here's the data, we're going to give you full visibility. It's more transparency into what's really happening. And the third piece of this, I always talk about trustless transparency, and that I kind of mentioned that by connecting the dots that were previously damaged by the lack of trust between parties. And this is just trustless kind of just implies that the users that are connecting to each other the parties don't necessarily have to trust each other. You can actually use the technology itself to act as a verifier or authenticator and a mediator between of the exchange of these different parties. And so those three things I always kind of mention to people is like the blockchain can create long-term accountability, creating these histories that are tamper-proof. They create data democratization. That means that everyone can participate in the same recording of information and make sure we're not locking someone out or manipulating data against them. And then create these trustless, transparent environments where we can connect dots that we previously couldn't connect. So I would say like those are the three things that revolutionized the way we think about, use cases. And we can go into a bunch of different use cases,
Hmm.
because you can think about carbon chains and coffee chains and cold chains, which all three of those things we've actually, participated in helping people track. But yeah, I would say those are my top three things to think about when you're even wanting to use a blockchain.
Right.
Think about, what are you looking for?
Yeah, Kim, you're right. When we spoke last time, I think I could have actually talked with you for days, and come up with so many ideas of where this would really be an advantage to many companies. So, really, what led you to create Topl in the first place?
So I'm originally from South Africa. And it's kind of my I always talk about the founder story. I actually made a post about the founder story this week on LinkedIn. But the reason I made the post is because my dad showed up on the South African mining cover, the cover of this edition of the South African Mining magazine this month. And I grew up in a mining family. We diamond mining, especially on the one side, and then these mines, very much where I grew up, is alluvial mines, so they're surface level mines. So that actually means that a lot of agriculture happens in these areas. So they're riverbed mines. So there's really good agricultural ground within these areas. So I grew up on the first part, like the first mile in the supply chain. I got to see a lot of what happens when you record information, or impact, or if you're trying to make a claim by the time you sell a product. If you sell an ethical diamond, if you say, this diamond is, no one died for this stone, or, this chocolate, no child labored over that chocolate. And I realized how difficult it is to record that information. And so when I was recruited to the US on a track scholarship, and before I came to the US, there was this like gap between when we graduate high school in South Africa and when we started here. And that's kind of where a lot of my Topl journey started. I spent some time with the development finance organization, traveling to about 18 different countries where we were doing disaster relief implementation. So in Thailand, we were doing tsunami rebuilding. In Guatemala, we were doing mudslide rebuilding. We were doing a bunch of different things during that time. But our job as an organization that was kind of sent in boots on the ground was to record the outcomes of the impact that these bigger organizations were making on the ground. And that's where my fascination started with, understanding. I had like an iPhone 8. It was like the year the iPhone 8 came out. And I was just fascinated about the technology leapfrogging that had happened in these regions, how much you actually had access to internet in very remote regions. And so I was really interested in the concept of network topology. That's where the word
Hmm.
Topl comes from. And really understanding that network topology of how do we create a censorship proof network that can create an environment where the person on the ground is the person actually recording, the actual individual receiving the goods, receiving the aid, is actually the person recording the impact and the outcome of what's going on. And that same network allows the biggest corporation or organization on the other side to see proof and evidence of what's actually happening on the ground. And so obviously when I came to the States, I studied math because I wanted to really understand a lot about network topology. And then I was pulled to Houston and Rice because there is a professor at Rice that I really, really wanted to work for. So I sent her an email, and the year I sent her an email, she was on the Fortune 50 list of most influential people in the
Oh,
world.
oh, good.
She had started this like global health institute at Rice, fascinating stuff. But what they were doing is taking technologies designed by Rice students, point of care diagnostic technologies, and actually implementing them in developing markets, making them more robust, scaling them up, making them more low cost so that they can actually be rolled out into these markets. And so I sent her an email and I said, I want to voluntarily come work for her because I'd really like to understand, like, because they had been known for tracking outcomes and impact and what they're doing in these
Hmm.
regions. And so she ended up emailing me back within like that same day. So obviously I came and worked for Rebecca. And so I worked for her for about a year. When 2014-15, we started seeing a lot of the articles come out from Reuters on like, children in the supply chains, all these different things about slavery and like modern slavery and what's going on. And I told her, I remember like especially telling her like, we have to, this is something we can truly create infrastructure technology that helps people make these sustainable and ethical claims from source. We need to build such an infrastructure. And she told me I need to solve the problem myself. And she would write me a recommendation letter and give me actually early funding, but very much was a situation of like, this is something that I think you should take on. So what I actually did is I enrolled in a dual degree program at Rice. I am the first and actually the only person that has done this at Rice, but I did a PhD in statistics because I really wanted to understand risk measurements and how do we measure different things like ESG and SDG, these things that we think are very, fluffy and not tangible necessarily yet. And then at the same time, economics, because I wanted to understand the game theory of how do you actually record these types of measures in a way that these players that are recording this information are incentivized to record accurately. So I
Hmm.
really wanted to understand that. So that's kind of the time, it was 2015 when I was introduced to my two co-founders who also Rice PhDs, or one was a Rice PhD, one was a Rice undergrad finishing off. And we had the two of them had been playing in the blockchain space, like literally like building applications on top of Ethereum. And the space at that time is only 7 years old because blockchains only, they started in 2008. And so that was the first blockchain, and then 15 was actually Ethereum that came about. So it's a very young space, let's put it that way. And so the three of us sat down and really said, how can we create an infrastructure that specifically is purpose built for tracking ethical and sustainable practices? How do we focus in on the actual, I talk about sustainable and ethical tracking or certification markets as more emerging markets. And
Hmm.
so how do you put infrastructure in emerging markets? How do you create an environment where you can actually track these behaviors from source? And so we sat down and said, what are the features and functionality that the tech needs to have for us to actually be able to track things from source, from different locations, from remote locations, from very low tech locations? So we really sat down and said, okay, how do we make this accessible as possible, as energy efficient as possible? How do we make it as low cost, but also as effective in the sense that I can actually access this from a flip phone? How do I
Hmm.
access a network from something as a text message on a flip phone? And so that's kind of where we sat down and realized like no infrastructures that are currently out there, a lot of them were built for more finance applications and not necessarily like tracking commodities and really thinking through that like differentiated commodity concept of it. So it was about 2 years of us kind of using our academic status to do a lot of research. So we spent a lot of
Hmm.
time with actually the UN, the World Bank, like a bunch of the more NGO connections, and then also a lot of enterprises understanding the needs and understanding what are the things that really need to exist, because we wanted to build a technology for the user and not really cool academic project
Hmm.
about tech that can just do a bunch of cool things. And so it was about 2017 summer when I was working as a quant at Invesco, and they asked me to build a themed ESG portfolio for them. And it was again one of those realizations of like that ESG data, like the reports you're pulling from all these companies. And I mean, like we're seeing daily now, we're seeing companies, big companies come out with their ESG initiatives and their carbon initiatives and all these different things right now.
Hmm.
But for me, it's always a thing. It's great to make these commitments and these claims, but how are you going to prove them to us? And so
Right.
it was when I saw that where I was again with, we're never going to transact on ESG until we don't start track and tracing actual behaviors inside the supply chains or inside the processes that these ESG behaviors are happening. And so it was that year that we started the company. And we wanted to move pretty quickly and get users onto the blockchain very quickly. So our first user was actually a living wage farming certification group. And we started company 17, by December of 18, which is very quickly for any
Hmm.
blockchain to kind of come about. We had this living wage farming certification group using our technology to essentially track the actual living wages, like the farmers themselves actually input information about what they were paid and the amount that they delivered to a washing station. And then the washing station actually reports the weight, and there's counter behaviors there, and then it just keeps going. And so this group was the first to actually create a living wage farming certification using our technology to prove every step. So when you actually scan the little QR code on the products that they now have for their certification, you see the whole journey of the product. You can actually see it all the way back to the farmer that specifically farmed that specific batch that you're even buying, or the product you're buying. So that was kind of like the first thing. And then 2019, we spent a lot of time really thinking through different use cases. So we had, that's why I mentioned carbon chains. We had, diamonds. I'm from a diamond family, so
That
obviously
would be natural.
we started tracking some stones from, we have birth certificates. My stone actually has birth certificate. I know the day it was born, the exact like ethical and sustainable practices of that specific mine, the geolocation of that, everything that is associated with it. And then we really wanted to spend time making this blockchain as accessible as possible. And so in 20, we spent a lot last year because of COVID, and we can jump into those details too. But we really spent time on really thinking through from a, how do we make this as accessible as possible for anyone, for any big enterprise or small startup? How do we help them? Because blockchains are really difficult to actually spin up and do different things with. So how do we make it as simple as like a simple developer plugging into an API? Like how do we make, like I always said, like we created a blockchain that was this airplane in the air. It had a monkey on a wing and a fire extinguisher. And then we had this private airstrip for this, using this blockchain. But then we really wanted to create a commercial airline. Like, how do you
Right.
access that? Like, how do we make it really easy for, I have developers in Fiji that I talk to, like how do we create an environment where anyone can access, and we can create a guided use of blockchain technology? There's no chasm between, oh, here's the advanced technology and I'm only a simple front-end developer. How do I build something like this? So we launched that in February this year. It's called Blockchain as a Service. And we created this like tooling and infrastructure layer. And we're actually expanding on that this year. Like what types of tools is necessary. And so we kind of have this blockchain as a service offering, and then this blockchain as a service plus offering, especially for enterprises, where we help like think through sustainability as a solution and really go through the whole change monster with them from ideation to implementation of how do you actually bring about those sustainable and ethical commitments you're making and you're putting out there and you're making public. How do we help you tangibly take the measures you're trying to capture and create an environment where you can capture them real time and actually add to your assurance inside your ESG report what's really going on. And so that's kind of been the journey. And now it's about more accessibility. It's creating an environment where, like we truly believe every company should be, an ESG focused company. So it's kind of just like now this focusing in on specific industries that we're working with and helping those different parties. But yeah, this is kind of the Topl story is a very like long journey because it started when I was very young. But it was definitely inspired by a lot of my own personal experiences early on in my life.
Well, there's so many things that one could say about that. I just hearing you speak, I look forward to the day that any consumer of anything can actually be assured that it came through your blockchain service. And so they would know that if they're seeking to buy sustainable goods or, fair pay, what have you, that they've got that guarantee. So definitely very, very important. Also, just want to take a minute and thank Rebecca for taking the bird and putting her out on her wings to make this happen. That the professor that you spoke about. So tell us about, you talked about COVID a little bit. Tell us about how the COVID crisis actually affected Topl. How did the pandemic actually affect Topl's trajectory? I can't even say the word, trajectory and positioning.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the biggest things that I was, running a social enterprise, like I always say, Topl as people, we are, social activists that became social entrepreneurs, and we're running a social enterprise for social change, right? So that's who we are as people. But it is, when I started this company, a lot of people were always like profit and purpose, they don't go hand in hand. right? This shouldn't be, if you're doing something purpose driven or you're building a social enterprise, like this doesn't make sense within, a very profit driven environment. But I have the more purpose driven profit approach. And so what was interesting in 2020 is that, this approach we had where we were like, okay, we truly believe that, ESG, like actually focusing in on environmental and social and governance issues will be the future, focusing in on the sustainable development goals and actually thinking through, how do you create measures out of these things that we don't even know how to measure yet. And so I think that was something that, people before 2020 were very much like, oh no, we shouldn't think about climate change. We shouldn't think about, global impacts, things that can actually transform our lives, like long-term accountability, right? We shouldn't think about like right now, how are we impacting the planet? But I feel like that's what happened in 2020. The pandemic really highlighted the fact that we needed to start thinking through purpose of people, one, because a lot of people were very much impacted by this planet, and then essentially purpose driven profit. So I think that, and it's kind of just evident, you're in a community that knows this, but like all the ESG initiatives coming out now. So I feel like ESG just like skyrocketed in like a buzzword, right? Like, and that was something we had already talked about like since 14, right? And SDGs is something we've been busy with since, early on. But it was that kind of transformation from an ESG side. And then from a tech side, a lot of people digitized, right? We're in Zoom now, right? We're, a lot of people that would have never actually created environment, like people who wouldn't have ever scanned a QR code in their life now eat with menus. Like they go to a restaurant and their menus on a QR code. So like the fact that you can have more information at your fingertip, we talk about the consumer taking back control, right? Like that's how I talk about like data democratization too, is the consumer being able to scan a product and actually see the journey of those products. But the fact that digitization and all of a sudden everyone went global, because now you have connected dots that, very much people didn't think that was possible. And you could have seen it in even the fundraising I had done last year. At the beginning of the year, people were like, I want to physically see you before I fund you. By the end of the year, I had majority of the funds invested in us and had never met me and have still not met me in person. And so I think like that type of, that's how from a macro level, like ESG and digitization really created an environment for us, like this ESG blockchain push really moved forward. And especially the fact that, our slogan says, you change the world, we'll help you prove it.
Yes.
So a lot of these companies coming out with these commitments now are saying, oh, wow, okay, we're making these commitments, but we also have a cancel culture or generation green, as what we call them, this generation that's going to question the things that the commitments people are putting out there. And so that questioning needs to come with proof. We need to add trust to the traceability we provide. We need to add proof to the claims that we're making. And so that's kind of where, like we realized that what we're building had all of a sudden been highlighted, like all the different pieces of it, and not even to mention like supply chains. Like last year, like really not being like for an auditor, not being able to go out to a remote village to actually check certification claims, right? Like those types of things. Like now people are like, okay, but is there a way I can electronically actually or digitally actually validate certain behaviors in these remote locations? Do I need these certifications to go back in these areas and actually audit? Because there isn't really auditors in these areas because there's institutional voids that just exist here. So those are the things that kind of happen is like as supply chain fragmentation and actual, like we saw the fragility of our supply chains. Also people started asking things about their products. It's like, why is Kroger empty? Like, why, why, like, I don't understand, like, what does our global supply chain have to, and I think those types of questioning of where are things coming from? What are we doing to the planet? How are we actually driving purpose? I think those are the things that kind of like last year opened up, and for us, just highlighted the stuff we'd already been solving, but now it's like we are so relevant for the time. And that's what was so important for me last year, to make this accessible to anyone. because it's really difficult. Blockchains are hard things to access. So that was
Yeah.
why it was so important for us to actually get, I would say like that's one thing that it spurred, was that accessibility piece of it, where I wanted to say like, well, we're global now. So
Hmm.
if you're in Kenya developing, or if you're in Fiji developing, like you should be able to access our technology. Yeah.
Fantastic. And, it really brings to light, like you said, the accountability for each of these chains, in the fact that, you can't get by with what you say anymore. You have to show that. And that's extremely important to a lot of the consumers nowadays, whether they be corporate consumers or individual consumers. It's very important. So, how does being a purpose driven company make Topple different?
I think like the biggest thing that I always tell people that we are, every startup wants to be a unicorn, right? But
Hmm.
Topple's seeking to grow what I call a herd of zebras. Now, zebras are companies that are doing both, and improving society and also doing business. So perfect purpose and profit, white and black, right? Zebras. So
Hmm.
they're actually focused on like changing the status quo. So like unicorns can disrupt, but zebras have the power to change, the way we do commerce, the way we think about interacting with our products, the way we think about interacting with organizations, right? And so I feel like that's where, from a differentiation, like how are we different? It's like our slogan being, "You change the world, we'll help you prove it." It
Hmm.
is about these zebras, about how can I take these companies that have really like that are track and tracing certain behaviors, or are really doing things. I've met some amazing companies where it's, repurposing plastic. How can they prove that?
Hmm.
Having, coffee sourced from specific regions, and specifically paying for the education of those farmers in those regions. How can they prove that? Right? Like these are all things that, we look at that and I'm like, these are zebra companies, right? And so how do I gather this herd of zebras in a place that I can actually create an environment? To give you an example, is like, here you are a coffee supply chain, but you're actually also doing agroforestry, and so you're protecting the land in that area. And so now there are these, natural, like actual carbon sequestration methods that you can actually capture that carbon. So how do you monetize that impact? If you're this like remote farm in the middle of nowhere, how can I actually create an environment, me as an infrastructure, as an ecosystem? How do I connect you? You're one of the stations using my rail system, and so now you're tracking carbon credits. How
Hmm.
do I make sure there's another station on my rail, so that there's a marketplace for you to actually go offset those carbon, so you can actually monetize your impact? So those are things that I've been spending a lot of time on, is like gathering this herd of zebras and actually the ecosystem as a whole, and really saying, how do I help you, coffee trader, that's actually doing agroforestry, monetize the impact of
Right.
agroforestry by helping you transact in a marketplace? So those are the types of things that it's more about the ecosystem, it's more about community collaboration and conversation than it is about the transaction itself between me and
Hmm.
the party that's actually using the technology. And I think that's why, a herd of zebras can do a lot more than one unicorn. Let's put it out.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that too, because so many times we see almost a chasm between being eco-friendly and that sort of thing, and really setting out to do good versus making any profit. And so the fact that you can bring those both together, and we can show that by really being a purpose-driven company, profit can come as well.
Mhm.
Both side by side, one doesn't eliminate the other. And so I love that. Um, in what industries is Topple blockchain most needed and most effective right now?
So I kind of have alluded to a few of these. So like you have carbon chains, where you actually right now you have the energy transformation going on. A lot of the carbon chain piece of this is double spending. The only other place in the world that talks about double spending other than carbon credits is
Mhm.
blockchains, because that is the problem that blockchains solve. They solve the double spending problem. They actually create an environment where you can deplete a resource, and you can actually not double spend. Like I can't sell you the carbon credits and someone else those carbon credits, because I can't double spend in a blockchain
Mhm.
infrastructure. So definitely carbon tracking, energy transformation, even tracking the emissions and being able to offset them automatically. Those are things that we're seeing a lot of right now. Coffee chains, as I've already alluded to, is, like very much in fragmentation of supply chains. Like you have various different actors that don't trust each other. So really thinking about supply chains that, not just coffee chains, but like any, I talk about like single origin goods or like high mind share goods like coffee, cacao, tea, like diamonds, the things that we actually like think about, like our makeup, like those types of things,
Hmm.
but like really fragmented supply chains that we're thinking through coordination that needs to happen between parties, and parties need to trust each other with claims and proof. And then you can kind of go further into like cold chains. So I kind of refer to like the coffee chains, the cold chains, like as the FDA, like the Food and Drug
Hmm.
regulated, requirements now to start having traceability within, like in the cold chain side. We actually have a project running on the Topl blockchain that they specifically track the temperature of the COVID-19 test kits, because they have to
Hmm.
stay within a certain temperature range. Otherwise, there's issues regarding like insurance and, different types of things, who's paying for what if the temperature drops. Same for the vaccines. If the temperature drops after, out of some angle, and you get the same thing for beef and chicken, like you have groups that
Hmm.
want to know what's going on from a temperature perspective. So we are seeing everything from a, like I would call it like energy transformation is pretty heavy right now. And then the FDA regulated or the essential traceability requirements that are coming through from a food perspective, from a drug
Hmm.
perspective of, digitizing your supply chain and showing the actual end user that they're not just, sticking a needle in their arm for,
Right.
of something that has already, it doesn't work. And I think like especially as we, a lot of people think, oh, we're going to be fully vaccinated in the US very soon. Sure, in the US, but developing countries won't be fully vaccinated,
Hmm.
probably won't even have rollouts until 23, right?
Mm.
And so there's going to be COVID, it's still going to be everywhere. So it's the reality of like, how do we make sure, like when we're sending these like COVID-19 tests to these very remote regions, the temperature is, being regulated, and we're
Hmm.
watching, these things, because otherwise we're just sending people like we do mostly, like sadly, this happens, is right. We send a lot of outdated drugs or outdated, medicines into these regions, and they aren't fully effective. And this
Right.
is especially true of the COVID-19 test kits and the vaccines themselves. So I think those are the things we're seeing as more urgent right
Hmm.
now, is the carbon tracking and the like whole, like the COVID-19 test kits and things like that. But it's mostly just a, I call the bigger picture being energy transformation and FDA regulation. Um, the more exciting stuff that I'm excited about with all these ESG like reporting and measuring is
Hmm.
actually results-based finance. That's the more like the third market I always talk about that's slowly coming about. It's like milestone oriented, like when you actually fund a project, you actually track certain milestones of that
Right.
project. So that results-based finance, green bonds, social impact bonds, all these things are starting to really become more prevalent. I see a lot of these people coming to us really asking about like, how do we create like tokenized like environments where we can actually
Hmm.
issue some result given a certain milestone achieved, and then have multilaterals or institutions buy those results or buy those tokenized impact pieces from us.
Hmm.
So we're seeing a lot more in the results space, like the impact investing space right now. So that's kind of the up and coming next wave that we're seeing. But it
Right.
all has to do, like a lot of those financings, a lot of those things, those projects, the results-based financing go into energy transformation projects, go into
Hmm.
food and drug projects. So it's an interesting bi-directional environment now, where you can track something from source to sale, and you can transact the impact
Hmm.
from the actual institution to the individual. So there's
Well,
some interesting stuff
I will tell you that's very exciting. Each piece of that, and we do in conscious capitalism have quite a number of investors who really look to invest in companies that that really make an impact, and I can see where you can help with that, and that yet fills your purpose as well. I had one more question, but we are at 8:16, so I would love to open up the meeting so that if anybody has any questions or comments, they can join in with us.
If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand in the app and we'll get to your question or post it into the Q&A section of the application. Go ahead, Bethany.
Hi, I'm just curious. I'm not really sure this is a question, but I'm really curious about this whole supply chain and the transparency around supply chain. Just recently, there was I'm going to call it a LinkedIn fist fight between an oil and gas company and North Face, in which the oil and gas company tried to order some jackets with a logo on it from North Face, and North Face refused to supply them the order because they're in the fossil fuel business. And so then this company and several others in the industry took it upon themselves to scrutinize the supply chain of North Face and started posting it. And North Face, I mean, it turns out, which is logical, that North Face can't actually create its products without fossil fuels within the supply chain. And I'm just curious how companies that are so kind of staunch and opinionated and, you know, I don't know, taking a stand, I guess I would say, but then they rely on what they're taking a stand against. And I'm just curious what you're seeing in that world and how that can be reconciled.
Yeah, so let's put this way. I'm married to an oil and gas investment banker. So there's a lot of those conversations happening even in this house. But I think like the biggest thing I've seen with talking to like different organizations is just like understanding, like there's like the internal visibility piece of like actually understanding your own supply chain. And then there's the external transparency piece. And I think the biggest thing is that greenwashing happens across the board. Like a lot of these, you know, taking stand or making commitments type groups that make the commitment for sustainable and ethical practices. A lot of them are now, like I had a really interesting conversation last week with an ESG like certification group that actually help you actually track your ESG reports. And what they had said about 20 years ago, a lot of the ESG reports and this like the way we actually make these claims, we borrowed some language, some materiality language from some of the accounting, you know, reports of like how do you, you know, say something is material, that you have a material impact. So they absolutely didn't think it would become like regulated, right? Like when they actually borrowed that language is like saying like we materially have this like specific social impact or the specific sustainable impact. So what they're seeing, these ESG reports group, they're seeing people pull back on their commitments because they're realizing they're going to be scrutinized on those commitments that they have made in these ESG reports, because there's now the assurance piece of like making these reports become questionable. And so what we're seeing is people wanting to, instead of just making these claims, they want to be able to prove them before they make them. And so we're seeing a lot of, you know, very interesting conversations about like, we would like to put this in our future ESG report. However, how can we prove that we actually did this? A good example is like I'm talking to, you know, an energy company that wants to prove that they're not using scarce water resources while they're actually fracking, right? That they're actually they're repurposing. And so some stuff like that become very interesting, because people are trying to, before they actually make that very loud claim, start proving it and then put it inside the reports. But I actually like that there is scrutiny going back and forth, because I feel like it's the same thing as like the conscious consumer actually asking questions and wanting to have, you know, probe into the visibility of what's going on. Because I honestly, I've talked a lot to fast fashion brands in the last few months, they don't even know where a lot of their goods are coming from. Everything going on in China right now, they don't know. A lot of groups just don't know. They're told by the, you know, like they go, it's like, I get the product from here, and then that group doesn't tell me where they get their product from. And so it kind of like the blame gets shifted back into like the previous party and the previous party and the previous party. And so what blockchains kind of provide, they're not going to like create an environment where fraud is eliminated, but they do create an environment where you can isolate certain behaviors and see where certain things happen and give you a little bit of internal visibility as a company. But I do see the scrutiny kind of coming across like on both sides. That's why for me, I'm all a part of like energy transformation and just being more aware of what you're doing to the planet than, you know, being against someone doing something.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Do we have any additional questions or comments? Well, Kim, it seems like it's a little slow on questions. That was a lot of information. I think people are still digesting. So I'm going to go ahead and ask that last question. And that was, is there anything else that you would like to add to this discussion this morning?
I mean, I think like the biggest thing that, you know, just that is interesting, like just kind of from what Bethany had just said, I think we're all like, this is something that's being figured out right now, that there is definitely a real, like I kind of referred to it earlier as like, I call this like ESG, like, or the sustainable and ethical commitment space in emerging markets. Right, it's like we just talked about it. These people make commitments, so there's scrutiny happening both ways, right? So I think it's absolutely fine to have that scrutiny. But I think like what I really think might be really interesting is more the questions of, make sure we're asking the questions of what are the tools that we need to actually prove these things. Like what is the way in which because we can go PR on each other and like people can go, you know, media on media, and it becomes a, you know, LinkedIn fistfight. I just think that there's a question that's deeper here, is like, what do we, and I feel like this also happened in the fintech space. So like before we can actually have these really interesting like Robinhood type environments, or like trading becomes like accessible to everyone, we had to first build like infrastructure. Bloomberg had to exist before we could actually like be like fintech space could take off. So I feel like it's the same thing for ESG right now. I think we are in a space where we need to quantify, we need to create attributes of these different behaviors. We need to prove that these changes exist and are accessible to everyone. There's just so much we're going to have to do, but I think we need to look at it more from a you know, what tools exist and do they even exist perspective, than a, oh, okay, so this is just a media greenwashing PR approach. And I'm very concerned. I mean, like that's also just what pulls PR in, right? It allows media, like it allows to get attention, negative or positive. But I feel the finger pointing thing right now is I feel it was fair to kind of point in the different direction, saying, oh, okay, you know, like, but you don't want to do this, but we don't want to like do that. I just think we have to go deeper into like, okay, so how do we solve this? And yeah, I think that's where we need to invest in these tools. We need to invest in these infrastructures. I think that's something that a lot of people ask me about from an impact investing space. Like, oh, which cool companies have you seen that does like green, or they have these clean clothes, or, you know, like all these different things. And I always say, but how do you know? Right? Like until you don't have the tools and the infrastructure to actually prove the behaviors that they're claiming, I mean, great, they're using products that are not harming the environment, but maybe next week they just don't have access to those products, and then they start like actually changing because margins matter, right? And so I think that's the stuff that becomes more like, what type of accountability are putting in place? And what are we investing in? Are we investing in infrastructure for new renewables, or are we investing in infrastructure to make sure that if someone claims a renewable energy credit, that we actually know that it's just one and it's not, triple spent, right? And I think those are the questions that I ask a lot of time, but it probably very much stems from the fact that I grew up in a country where I didn't trust institutions. You don't trust the government. So you always question anyone telling you anything or any claim that they're making, and you always want someone to prove something to you. But I think it is okay, so finger pointing happened. How do we prove these things? What exists out there so we can leverage these different tools? And I think we need to put money into that, because there's so many cool like carbon accounting tools out there. There's just very interesting stuff I'm seeing in the space right now that will help a lot of these problems resolve themselves. But yeah, I think it's the whole look at the speck in your own eye before you look at
Yes. What is it? Was it remove the log out of your own eye before you inspect the speck in your brother's, right? Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's something that I'm seeing a lot of. So I would say that's probably, look inside before you look outside.
Yes. Well, what you're doing is very exciting, Kim. We so look forward to watching Topl grow and all the wonderful things that the company as well as the founders will be doing. I caught something earlier. I think you said that you might have posted an article on LinkedIn. Should we direct folks to look for something about you on LinkedIn this week?
Oh, I mean, like we are about to actually put out a white paper on how COVID disrupts some of the coffee supply chains and how blockchains can help with that. So yeah, definitely, feel free to, add me on LinkedIn, ask more questions on LinkedIn. I try and share as much information as I can on the space and what I'm seeing. So definitely a different angle than a lot of the enterprise people that I talk to, especially the C-suite people. But yeah, and then follow Topl. We're trying to put a lot of more thought leadership pieces out on how to think about this space. We actually also teach the blockchain course at Rice, so we really try and help people understand this technology and the capabilities of this technology. So happy to talk to people if they have any ideas or initiatives that they want to walk through or talk through.
Fantastic. That would be great. And Kim, should they just connect with you through LinkedIn, or is there any information you want to provide for folks who want to explore this more?
Yeah, so my email is kim@topl.me. And my LinkedIn, if you just put a little message in LinkedIn and say like, hey, I heard you on this and I'd like to talk to you about X, Y, and Z, then I can just reply with an email, or you can put your email in there and we can just converse from there. I try and check LinkedIn like every other week, at least from a message perspective, because I tell people to do this a lot, but it helps when there's a little message extra where and how we met.
Right. So perfect. So as well, we have an email for Conscious Capitalism. If you go on our page for the Houston chapter, you can always send us some information that we could forward on to Kim, or questions that we could forward on to Kim. Devlin, I would love to invite you to just sort of wrap this up if you're open to that, and talk about what's coming up for us. This was unplanned, so he may not be ready to talk about it. So I'm going to jump in and say that we are doing these sessions every quarter, meant to be educational. So far, we have covered conscious leadership, purpose, and our next one coming up is going to be, I believe it's the stakeholder, but please check our website. We'll be sending out notices as well. And Kim, we just can't thank you enough for not only being here, but also for what you're doing. It's extremely exciting, and we'll be following you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Everybody take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.